Biblical Shakers. This week, the reading from the book of Job, chapters 35 through 39, is going to be way more interesting because the Lord Himself speaks at the end of the week. The first two chapters will be conversation from Elihu, the fourth speaker, and then God Himself. I encourage a chapter reading daily and then enjoy the posted devotions for each day. And if you haven't checked out my blog, please do so at biblicalshakers.blogspot.com. You'll find a little bit about the history of the blog and some about the authors who write the devotions. Elihu opens our reading for the week in chapter 35, where his conversation is sandwiched between his rebuke of Job's self-righteousness from chapter 34 and his praise of God's majesty. His conclusion was that God is still concerned, even though He doesn't intervene immediately in every given situation. I love verse 10, where it says, "Our God gives us songs in the night." He may not take away our trials immediately, but He can give a message with His voice when there is not a ray of light by which to read. Elihu criticized Job for questioning God in chapter 36, but he did not judge himself for speaking on God's behalf. What pride that any man should claim to have perfect knowledge and be able to serve as God's spokesman and defender. Yes, he did have some right things to say about God, though. He claimed that God is mighty in power and understanding, exalted and sovereign in all that He does, and great above all gods. Continuing with his thoughts in chapter 37, he states that nothing can compare to God, and does so by comparing God to the signs of nature that we have no control over. He concluded his speech with this tremendous truth. Faith in God is far more important than Job's desire for an explanation of his suffering. Elihu came so close to helping Job, but failed again because of his "I know it all" attitude. For Job knew all of this before Elihu was even born. It is here that God Himself breaks into the discussion to draw out the right conclusions. Out of the mighty storm, God spoke in chapter 38. God used Job's ignorance of the earth's natural order to reveal His ignorance of God's moral order. God questioned Job about creation, the regulating of nature, the stars and clouds in the heavens, and the ways of the animals and the birds. If Job could not understand these things, how could he possibly understand God's mind and character? The only option is to submit to His authority and rest in His care. God uses everyday untamed creatures in chapter 39 to show that He manages a universe far more complex than Job's personal suffering. The point is not to belittle Job, but to enlarge his perspective. The problems of life are solved not by reasons, but by relationships. Job wanted to reason with God, but what he really needed was to rest by God. Job saw God's greatness and his own littleness, and that was the turning point. The smaller we are in our own eyes, the greater God makes us in His sight. God did not lecture much. He didn't only questioning. And God continues with talking next week. to Job, you will have to check in and see, because Biblical Shakers makes reading the Bible way more enjoyable for you. And I pray the Lord will put a hunger on your heart